What would you do if on a frozen patrol in the dead of winter you found a beaten Apache woman left to die in the snow? Would you risk your life and reputation to save her or ride on and let the storm claim her? The cold had teeth that winter. It wasn't the clean, crisp cold of an autumn morning, but a deep, predatory chill that seeped into the marrow of your bones and stayed there a constant, unwelcome guest. For 3 years I'd been the marshal of Solitude Creek, a town that lived up to its name, and I had come to know the nuances of its winters intimately. This one, however, felt different. It was hungrier, more relentless, as if the vast white emptiness of the plains had finally decided to swallow what little warmth and life remained. My name is Jedediah Jed Stone. At 34, I felt older than the worn granite peaks that watched over our valley. The war had done that, scouring away my youth and leaving behind a man who preferred the company of silence. It wasn't just the battles, the noise, and the blood. It was the quiet moments after the faces of the men you couldn't save replaying in the firelight. I'd seen a boy from Georgia no older than 17 bleed out while talking about the peach trees in his father's orchard. That memory, more than any cannon blast, was the ghost that rode with me in the biting wind. I came west seeking peace, a place quiet enough to drown out the echoes, but all I found was a different kind of war. One fought against the land, against lawlessness, and most profoundly against myself. My cabin was a 2-hour ride from town, a small, sturdy defense against the world, and I had long since convinced myself that its solitude was a choice, not a sentence. I was on my northern patrol, a thankless task I performed with grim regularity. The wind howled a lonesome tune through the pines, a high, mournful sound that scraped at the nerves. My horse Vulcan, a big roan with more sense than most men I knew, snorted clouds of steam that froze almost instantly in the air. My greatcoat, lined with thick sheepskin, was my only shield against the elements, but even it felt insufficient. The cold found its way through the seams, 100 tiny daggers against my skin. It was in this state of frozen monotony, my mind replaying the sight of Georgia peaches, turning red in the dust, that I saw it. At first it was just a dark shape against the stark white of a snowdrift huddled at the base of a skeletal aspen, an anomaly in a world of white. My war-honed instincts screamed ambush. I reined Vulcan to a halt, so sharply he tossed his head in protest. My hand dropped by reflex to the cold, reassuring weight of the Colt at my hip, the leather of the holster worn smooth by years of habit. My eyes scanned the silent, snow-laden trees, searching for any sign of movement, for the glint of a rifle barrel or the puff of a hidden breath. There was nothing. The world was utterly still, muffled by a fresh blanket of snow, a silence so deep it felt loud. Curiosity, a dangerous thing in these parts, won out over caution. I dismounted my boots, sinking deep into the powder with a soft crunch. The air was so cold it burned to breathe. I approached the shape with the slow, deliberate steps of a man walking into a trap, my senses on fire, every nerve ending screaming. The closer I got, the more the shape resolved itself. It wasn't a bundle of discarded rags or a dead animal. It was a person, a woman. She was curled into a tight ball, a desperate final attempt to conserve a life that was clearly fading. Her dress, made of finely worked deerskin, was torn and shredded, offering little protection from the elements that were actively trying to claim her. One shoulder was bare, the skin an alarming shade of blue-white, the color of a frozen lake under a winter moon. Her hair, black as a raven's wing, was fanned out against the snow, each strand laced with delicate, cruel crystals of ice. She was Apache, that much was clear from the high cheekbones and the intricate beadwork that remained on a fragment of her dress. My stomach clenched into a tight, angry knot. This wasn't just the work of the cold. The violent tears in her clothing, the raw, bruised skin visible beneath it, spoke of a brutal struggle, of a violation that went beyond mere survival. Someone had done this to her. They had broken her and left her for the winter to finish the job. A wave of cold fury, sharper and more bitter than the wind, washed over me. It was an old familiar feeling, the righteous anger that I thought the war had burned out of me. Crouching beside her, I pulled off a glove with my teeth, the leather stiff and cold. I pressed 2 numb fingers against her neck under the line of her jaw. For a heart-stopping moment that stretched into an eternity, there was nothing. My own heart hammered against my ribs. Damn it, you're too late. Then I felt it, a pulse so faint, so thready, it was more a memory of a heartbeat than the real thing. A desperate flutter against the void. She was alive. Just barely. The question of what to do next weighed on me as heavily as the snow-filled sky. Bringing an Apache woman to Solitude Creek was like carrying a lit torch into a powder keg. The raids last autumn were still fresh wounds, and the townsfolk in their fear and anger rarely bothered to distinguish between the guilty and the innocent. To them, she would be a symbol of their fear. There were men in that town, men I drank with and arrested in turn, who would see her as an object of hate, a target for their vengeance. Leaving her here, however, was a death sentence. It was walking past the boy from Georgia all over again. My father's voice echoed in my memory, a low murmur beneath the wind's shriek. He'd been a blacksmith, a man of few words but unshakable principle. I remembered him standing by his forge, the firelight playing on his stern face. Right is right, Jed, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. The decision was made. There was no other choice a man could live with. With a grunt that was lost in the wind, I slid my arms beneath her. She was shockingly light, a fragile collection of bones and chilling skin. Her body was stiff, unyielding as frozen timber. As I lifted her, a faint, almost inaudible sound escaped her blue-tinged lips, a ghost of a word. Her eyes fluttered open for a second, dark and unfocused, vast pools of night before sliding shut again. She went limp in my arms, a dead weight that felt heavier than any burden I had ever carried. The ride back to my cabin was an eternity of slow, careful movement. I wrapped her in my greatcoat, the sheepskin still holding some of my warmth, and pressed her against my chest. I could feel her shallow, hitching breaths against my ribs, each one. A small miracle, each pause between them, a terrifying void where I held my own breath. I found myself praying a thing I hadn't done in years, the words clumsy and foreign on my tongue, bargaining with a God I wasn't sure I believed in anymore. Just let her live. Let me get her there. That's all I ask. When the faint plume of smoke from my chimney finally came into view, a thin gray line against the darkening sky, a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled me, washed through my body. I didn't bother with the door latch, kicking it open with my boot and carrying her straight inside. The cabin, which had always been my sanctuary of solitude, suddenly felt small and crowded with the awesome responsibility of another life. I laid her down on my bed, the only bed, and gently drew the patchwork quilts over her still form. In the warm, flickering light of the kerosene lamp, the extent of her injuries was horrifyingly clear. Dark, ugly bruises marred her ribs and thigh like storm clouds on her skin. And on her shoulder, an older, more sinister mark scarred her flesh, a burn shaped too deliberately to be an accident. It was a brand, a symbol of ownership, of utter degradation. My hands, usually rock-steady, trembled with a rage so pure it felt like ice in my veins. I stoked the fire in the cast-iron stove until it roared to life, a physical manifestation of my own fury. I put a kettle on to boil and found a small piece of dried venison to make a weak broth, my movements mechanical while my mind reeled. As I worked, a feeling I couldn't name settled in my chest. It was more than pity, deeper than the anger I felt toward her unknown assailants. It was a stark, unyielding sense of responsibility. I had intervened. I had pulled her back from the edge. Her life, for better or worse, was now tied to mine. When the broth was ready, I sat on the edge of the bed and gently lifted her head. I touched the warm tin cup to her lips. Her eyes flickered open again, and this time there was a spark of awareness in them. They were dark, deep-set eyes, and in their depths I saw a fear that cut me to the quick. It wasn't the fear of death. She looked as if she had already made her peace with that. It was the fear of me. The fear of what the man who had saved her might demand in return. The fear of a debt she couldn't possibly pay. I pulled back slightly, wanting to give her space to show her she was in no danger. I kept my voice low and steady, hoping the tone, if not the words, would offer some comfort. "You're safe now," I said, the sound rough in the quiet room. "My name is Jedediah Stone. Folks call me Jed. I'm the marshal. I won't let any harm come to you here." She didn't respond, her eyelids sinking shut once more, but I thought I saw some of the tension leave the tight line of her body. Her breathing seemed to deepen to steady. For the rest of that long, dark night, I sat in the chair beside the bed, watching the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of her chest under the quilts. I didn't know who she was or what horrors she had fled. I only knew that on a frozen patrol at the edge of the world, I had made a choice. And I had the unshakable feeling that the quiet, solitary life of Marshal Jed Stone was over. The long night bled into a gray, muted dawn. I hadn't slept, not really. I dozed fitfully in my worn armchair, my Colt, resting on the small table beside me, my senses tuned to every sound in the cabin. The old soldier in me never truly stood down. Rest was a luxury, vigilance a necessity. Each time she whimpered in her fevered sleep, my head would snap up, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. With the first pale light filtering through the shutters, I leaned over her. The bluish tint had completely receded from her skin, replaced by a pale, almost translucent quality. I placed the back of my hand against her forehead. The feverish heat from the night had broken. She was still cool, but it was the cool of a living person, not the deathly chill of the snow. A breath I hadn't realized I was holding escaped my lips in a ragged sigh that fogged in the cold air of the cabin. I moved quietly, pulling on my fleece-lined boots and feeding fresh logs into the stove until a satisfying roar filled the silence. The cabin, my small fortress of solitude, felt different now, charged with a new fragile purpose. I stepped outside to break the thin layer of ice in the water barrel, the cold air hitting my lungs like a physical blow. The world was a masterpiece of white and gray, silent and unforgiving. My gaze swept the tree line out of habit, searching for tracks, for any sign that we were not alone. There was nothing but the disturbed snow from my own arrival. Whoever had left her to die was long gone, swallowed by the storm. When I stepped back inside, the warmth of the cabin enveloped me like a blanket. I saw her eyes were open, and this time they were clear-focused and fixed directly on me. She lay perfectly still, a wild, cornered thing, her dark hair a stark contrast against my white pillowcase. Fear was still there, etched into the tense line of her jaw, but beneath it was a sharp, assessing intelligence. She was taking my measure, weighing my every move, my every breath. I set the heavy water bucket down slowly, the sloshing sound echoing in the stillness. I made my movements deliberate, non-threatening. "You're awake," I said. The words sounded loud and clumsy. It occurred to me that I hadn't spoken a full sentence to another human being in over a week. "I'm Jed Stone, the Marshal." She watched me, her silence a heavy blanket in the small room. I could see the questions in her eyes, the wariness of an animal that has known too many traps. I poured a cup of water from the bucket and held it out to her. For a long moment she just stared at it, then at me, her gaze flickering between the two. Finally, with a wince of pain that she quickly suppressed, she pushed herself up on one elbow, her movements stiff and slow. She took the cup with a hand that trembled almost uncontrollably. She drank in small, cautious sips, her eyes never leaving my face. When the cup was empty, her lips parted. Her voice was a dry, hoarse whisper, like autumn leaves skittering across stone. "Naya." Just one word. Her name. It grounded her, gave her an identity beyond the broken victim I had found in the snow. It was a claim to herself, a defiant spark in the ashes. I gave a slow nod, repeating the name to commit it to memory, letting it settle in the room. Naya. I warmed some leftover beans and a piece of bread, a simple meal that suddenly felt like a sacrament. I brought the plate to her, and she ate with the same careful, deliberate pace, as if her body had forgotten the sensation of food, or perhaps feared it would be snatched away. In the clearer light of morning, the bruises on her skin seemed darker, more violent. I forced myself to look away, not wanting her to misinterpret my concern as morbid curiosity. The questions burned inside me like hot coals. Who did this to you? Why? But I knew better than to ask. Her survival was a fragile flame, and trust was the fuel it needed to grow stronger. Pushing her now would only extinguish it. I pulled on my greatcoat and picked up my hat. "I have to ride into town," I explained, my hand on the wooden door latch. "Need to check the mail, get some supplies." I paused, turning back to meet her gaze, needing her to believe me. "You'll be safe here. The door has a strong bar and there's plenty of wood for the stove. No one will bother you. I give you my word." She gave the slightest of nods, a barely perceptible movement, but her fingers tightened on the edge of the quilt, pulling it closer around her, her only armor. The ride to Solitude Creek felt different. My thoughts weren't on the trail or the patrol. They were back in the cabin with the woman whose life I had stumbled into. I saw her sharp, wary eyes, the map of pain on her body. I thought of the town of the narrowed eyes and tight-lipped whispers that would greet the news of her existence. For 3 years I had maintained a careful distance from the townsfolk, a professional boundary that protected my own scarred interior. By bringing her into my home, I had shattered that boundary. And as Vulcan's hooves crunched through the snow, I found I couldn't summon an ounce of regret. At Croft's Mercantile, the bell above the door announced my arrival with a cheerful jingle that felt entirely out of place. Silas Croft, a man whose face seemed permanently pinched in disapproval, looked up from behind his counter. "Marshal," he grunted by way of greeting. I gathered what I needed: flour, coffee, salt, and on an impulse, a small tin of salve and clean linen bandages. As I placed the items on the counter, Silas's sharp eyes noted the extra quantity. "Stocking up for a long winter, Jed?" He asked, a sly edge to his voice. "Something like that," I replied, my tone flat, discouraging further questions. He weighed the flour, his movements slow and deliberate. "Heard some of the boys from the Bar T Ranch talkin'. Said they saw strange tracks up north. Not animal tracks." He looked at me expectantly, his eyes gleaming with grubby curiosity. "I'll look into it," I said, handing him the coins. I knew what he was fishing for. News traveled fast in a town this small, but speculation traveled faster. I had to get ahead of it, control it. When I returned to the cabin, the sun was low in the sky, casting long blue shadows across the snow. A profound sense of unease settled over me as I pictured her alone, vulnerable. I urged Vulcan into a faster pace. I found Naya sitting up by the stove, wrapped in one of my quilts. She had found my small sewing kit and was clumsily trying to stitch the torn strap of her deerskin dress. The thread was too thick, the needle too large for the fine hide, but she worked with a fierce, quiet determination that I was beginning to recognize as a core part of her. Her eyes lifted as I entered, and for the first time I saw something other than fear in them. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a kind of weary acknowledgement, a silent recognition of my return. I had come back. I set the supplies on the small wooden table. The unspoken reality of our situation settled between us. Her story was a book I hadn't opened, and I was now a character in it, whether I liked it or not. The quiet of my cabin was no longer empty. It was filled with the waiting. The days that followed fell into a strange new rhythm, a silent dance of two solitary people learning the shape of each other's space. My cabin, once a bastion of monastic silence, was now filled with the subtle sounds of her existence, the soft pad of stockinged feet on the wooden floor, the whisper of a needle through hide, the quiet sigh of breath in the chair by the fire. I felt her presence like a low hum beneath the surface of my own solitary life, a constant low-grade disruption to the peace I had so carefully cultivated. She remained wrapped in my quilt, a barrier of wool and cotton against the world, and continued her painstaking work on the tattered dress. I watched her one morning, her brow furrowed in concentration, her fingers, though still stiff, moving with increasing dexterity. I realized I knew nothing about her. Had she a family, a home, a people who were searching for her? The questions were a constant pressure in my mind, but I held them back. Kindness, I reasoned, was giving her the space to heal without the burden of explanation. Or perhaps, if I was being honest with myself, I was simply afraid of what the answers might reveal. Afraid that someone might come to claim her, leaving my world as silent and empty as it was before. One afternoon, as I sat at the table cleaning my rifle, the familiar sharp scent of gun oil filling the air, she finally spoke, her voice breaking the companionable silence. Why, her voice was still rough, rusty from disuse, but stronger now. I paused, a cleaning rag halfway through the barrel of my Winchester, the motion frozen. Why, what her gaze was direct, unwavering, cutting through all pretense. "You carried me here. You could have ridden on. Left me." It was a fair question, the one I knew had been sitting between us since she awoke. I leaned back in my chair, my eyes tracing the grain of the wooden table. I could have given her the simple answer, the one a lawman gives. It's my duty to help those in need. But that felt dishonest, incomplete. The truth was more complicated, rooted deeper in the man I was before the badge. "Seemed wrong to leave you," I said finally, my voice low. "Saw too much of that during the war. Men walking past the wounded because it was easier, because they had their own destination. I promised myself I wouldn't be one of them." I looked up from the table and met her eyes, letting her see the truth of it. A man is defined by the things he chooses to walk past and the things he chooses to carry. I couldn't walk past you. She held my gaze for a long time, her dark eyes searching my face, digging for the truth beneath the words. She didn't offer thanks or platitudes. She simply gave a slow, deliberate nod and turned her attention back to her sewing. But I saw a change in her hands. They moved with a new steadiness, as if my answer had unburdened her of some invisible weight, the weight of a debt she thought she owed. By evening, she was stronger. She insisted on fetching a bucket of water from the barrel just outside the door. I watched from the doorway as she navigated the packed snow in her bare feet, her steps unsteady but determined. When she stumbled, I moved forward instinctively, but she caught herself, her back rigid, with a pride that was both fierce and fragile. The sight of her red, raw feet on the frozen ground sent a pang of something sharp through my chest. Later, when she was by the fire, her feet tucked beneath the quilt, I retrieved a thick pair of my own wool socks from my trunk and left them on the hearth. I said nothing. She put them on without comment, but I saw the way her shoulders relaxed, a small surrender to comfort. That night, after a simple meal of beans and salted pork eaten in our usual silence, I sat cleaning my Colt, the rhythmic click of the cylinder, a familiar meditative sound. Naya sat across the table, the lamplight casting warm shadows on her face. The bruises were beginning to fade, turning from angry purples to mottled yellows and greens. The brand on her shoulder, however, which I sometimes glimpsed when she moved, seemed darker, a permanent testament to some past horror. I decided to risk a simple question, my voice softer than I intended. "Do you have people? A family somewhere?" Her hands, which had been resting in her lap, clenched into fists so tight her knuckles went white. She stared into the lamp's flame, her expression unreadable, her face a stone mask. The silence stretched thick and heavy with unspoken pain. Finally she spoke, her voice flat and final, devoid of all emotion. "Not anymore." The two words hung in the air, imbued with a history of loss I couldn't begin to fathom. I knew that kind of loss. I had buried my parents before I went to war and buried too many friends during it. I gave a single slow nod to show I understood that I wouldn't press further. We returned to our separate tasks. The silence between us, no longer feeling like an empty chasm but like a shared space, a quiet understanding of grief. Later, as the fire burned down to glowing embers and a deep chill crept into the cabin, I prepared to settle into my armchair for the night as had become my custom. But when I glanced at the bed, I saw that Naya had moved to the far side, leaving a clear, empty space beside her. Her eyes were open, watching me in the dim light. I hesitated, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. The invitation was unspoken but unmistakable. It wasn't an offer of intimacy, I knew that. It was an acknowledgement, a concession that my presence was not a threat. It was the first fragile seed of trust, a seedling pushing its way through frozen ground. To lie down beside her would be to cross a threshold, to change the dynamic between us irrevocably. To remain in the chair would be to preserve the distance, to respect a boundary she was now offering to move. My body ached from the cold, hard floor and the cramped confines of the armchair, but some instinct, some deep-seated need to prove my intentions were honorable, to prove I was not like the men who had hurt her, held me back. I walked to the bed, my boots silent on the floorboards. Instead of lying down, I took the spare blanket from the foot of it and tucked it more securely around her shoulders. Her skin was warm to the touch, and for a brief second her fingers brushed mine. "Rest well, Naya," I murmured, my voice thick. I returned to my chair, settled in, and let my eyes drift shut. I heard her shift, a soft rustle of quilts, and in the steady, even rhythm of her breathing that followed, I found a sense of peace that had eluded me for a very long time. I didn't see the way she reached out in the near darkness, her hand hovering over the empty space beside her, testing the air between us before letting it rest on the warm spot my presence would have made. The storm hit without warning, a furious blizzard that descended from the mountains like a charging beast. One moment the sky was a sheet of dull pewter. The next the world dissolved into a maelstrom of driving snow and shrieking wind. I'd seen enough high country winters to recognize the signs. I spent the afternoon securing the cabin, checking the shutters, banking snow against the northern wall for insulation, and hauling in enough firewood to last us for days. The air grew heavy, pregnant with the coming fury. By nightfall, the cabin felt like a ship tossed on a roiling frozen sea. The wind howled and clawed at the walls, a living thing trying to get in. Snow beat against the single window pane with the force of thrown gravel. Inside, the fire in the stove cast a warm, defiant glow, but the cold was a palpable entity pressing in from all sides, seeping through the very logs of the walls. Naya sat on the bed, my largest quilt wrapped around her like a cocoon. She watched me with those dark, weary eyes, her gaze following my every move as I made my preparations. She'd eaten little, and though the healthy color was slowly returning to her face, she was still painfully thin, her body a fragile silhouette beneath the layers of wool. I could see her shivering, a fine, uncontrollable tremor that she tried to conceal by clenching her jaw. Pride is a stubborn thing. It can be all a person is left when everything else has been stripped away. I understood that, but I also knew this kind of deep body cold wasn't something you could fight with pride alone. It was a thief that stole your strength, then your life. I poured the last of the boiled water into a tin mug, the steam a welcome sight in the chilly air, and carried it over to her. "Here, this will help." She took it, her hands shaking so much that the hot water sloshed over the rim. She drank it slowly, her eyes darting toward the window where the storm raged on a white fury obscuring the world. "It will not stop soon," she stated, her voice tight with an anxiety I couldn't quite place. I shook my head, my own voice low to be heard over the wind's deafening roar. "Could be days. This is a bad one." She said nothing, just pulled the quilt tighter, making herself smaller as if to disappear. I busied myself with pointless tasks, checking the door bar for the 10th time, rearranging the woodpile, but my attention was fixed on her. The tremors were worsening, her body shaking in violent spasmodic jerks that rattled her teeth. She was losing the fight. I made my decision. There was no other choice. I crossed the small room and sat on the edge of the bed. She flinched, her body going rigid, her eyes wide and wary in the firelight. I kept my voice calm, even stripping it of any emotion but simple, practical concern. "Naya, you can't get through the night like this. The fire isn't enough. You're too weak. The only thing that works against this kind of cold is shared body heat." Her lips pressed into a thin white line. I saw the conflict in her eyes, the stark terror of proximity, the fierce pride and the cold, hard logic of survival. For a tense moment, a lifetime, I thought she would refuse. I was prepared to accept her decision to retreat to my chair and watch over her helplessly as the cold consumed her. But then she gave a single sharp nod, a gesture of desperate concession, a choice for life over fear. I pulled off my boots and slid onto the bed, keeping a respectful distance. The mattress ropes creaked under my weight. I lay on my back, staring up at the dark-sloped ceiling, acutely aware of her presence beside me. At first, she remained a rigid, unmoving presence, her back half turned. But the cold was a relentless, persuasive enemy. Slowly, hesitantly, she shifted closer. I felt the violent trembling of her body as her back pressed against my side. Her head came to rest against my shoulder, and a small cold hand found its way to my chest, resting there uncertainly. I could feel the frantic, bird-like flutter of her pulse through her fingertips. It was a tangible measure of her fear, her exhaustion, her life. I didn't move. I didn't wrap my arm around her or pull her closer. I simply lay there, a bulwark of warmth offered without condition, without demand. My own breathing was slow and even a steady rhythm in the heart of the storm. Gradually, the violent shivers subsided, replaced by a finer trembling and then finally stillness. In the relative quiet, with the storm as our only witness, the unspoken questions between us seemed to surface in the charged air. Who had branded her? Who had beaten her and left her for dead? What horrors had she endured that made the simple, non-threatening touch of another person a thing to be feared? I also wondered what it meant that this woman, this stranger, was now lying in my bed, her life tethered to mine by a thread of shared warmth. Her voice, when it came, was a near whisper, a fragile sound spoken into the fabric of my shirt. "I thought I would die out there." I closed my eyes and waited for the end. She paused, her breath catching in a small, sharp sob that she quickly stifled. But I woke up here. I turned my head slightly, my cheek brushing against her hair. The faint, clean scent of wood smoke and something uniquely her clung to it. Our eyes met in the dim, flickering firelight. There was no gratitude in her expression, not yet. There was something more valuable. A raw, unvarnished honesty, a glimpse into the abyss she had faced. "Not on my watch," I said, my voice rough with an emotion I couldn't define. "As long as I'm drawing breath, you'll be safe here." She held my gaze for a long moment, then she seemed to let go of the last of her resistance. Her head settled more fully against my chest, and her hand, which had been resting so tentatively, relaxed, her fingers uncurling against my shirt. Not long after, her breathing deepened into the slow, even cadence of sleep. I lay awake long into the night, listening to the two sounds that defined my world: the furious howl of the storm outside, and the quiet, steady breath of the woman beside me. It wasn't intimacy, not in the way most people would understand it. It was something more primal, more fundamental. It was survival. But I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that something irrevocable had shifted between us. When the storm finally broke and the sun rose again, nothing would be the same. The storm blew itself out by morning, leaving behind a world transformed, reborn in white. The snow was immense, sculpted by the wind into deep, sweeping drifts that buried my fence posts and rose halfway up the cabin walls. A profound, almost sacred silence had fallen the heavy blanket of new snow, smothering all sound, creating a sense of pristine isolation. Inside, I moved with a newfound caution as if not to disturb the fragile peace. Naya was still asleep, curled on her side, one hand resting on the pillow where my head had been. The harsh lines of pain and fear had softened from her face, replaced by the peaceful vacuity of deep healing rest. For the first time, I allowed myself to truly look at her, not as a patient to be tended or a threat to be assessed, but as a woman. There was a strength in the line of her jaw, a fierce resilience that even her ordeal could not erase, a quiet dignity that humbled me. I stoked the fire and put coffee on to boil the familiar morning ritual, feeling both comforting and inadequate. Survival was one thing. What came next was another entirely. The town of Solitude Creek, with its narrow minds and long memories, loomed large in my thoughts. Sooner or later, questions would be asked. My isolation, once a shield, now made me a subject of intense suspicion. I set a steaming mug of coffee on the small crate beside the bed. The rich aroma seemed to gently pull her from sleep. She stirred her eyes, opening slowly, the weariness returning as a familiar mask as she remembered where she was and who she was with. She had survived the night, the storm. But the real storm, I suspected, was yet to come. "You'll need your strength today," I said, my voice quiet. "We have to go into town." Her reaction was immediate and visceral. Her body went rigid, her eyes widened, and her fingers clenched the quilt, pulling it up to her chin. Town. The word was a choked whisper filled with a palpable dread that seemed to suck the warmth from the room. I nodded, my expression grim as I pictured what awaited us. "I'm almost out of flour and coffee. More importantly, we need medicine, proper bandages for your cuts. The salve I have is nearly gone." I paused, letting the practicalities sink in before delivering the harder truth. "If I ride in alone after being snowed in for days and buy twice the usual supplies, people will talk. They'll get curious. It won't take long for someone to ride out here to see for himself. It's better they see you with me under my protection. It's better we face it head on our own terms." She searched my face, her gaze intense, trying to discern if this was a trick, another form of betrayal. I could see the frantic calculations behind her eyes, weighing the terror of the town against the potential danger of remaining hidden. I understood her hesitation. She had no reason to trust a world that had shown her nothing but brutality. I met her gaze without flinching, pouring every ounce of sincerity I possessed into my own. "I will not let anyone harm you, Naya. I give you my word as marshal and as a man. No one will lay a hand on you while I am standing." By mid-morning, the sun was bright on the new snow, the glare almost blinding. I saddled Vulcan, then fashioned a makeshift second seat behind my saddle, using a spare blanket and some rope. When Naya stepped out of the cabin, she was engulfed in my spare greatcoat, the heavy sheepskin dwarfing her slender frame. She blinked against the bright light, her eyes scanning the vast white expanse as if expecting an attack from every direction. She moved with the cautious grace of a deer stepping into a clearing. I helped her onto the horse. She settled behind me, her hands resting lightly on my hips, not for intimacy but for balance. Her touch was tentative, a mere ghost of pressure, yet it sent a jolt through me, a current of warmth against the cold. The ride was slow, Vulcan laboring through the deep drifts, his breath pluming in the frigid air. The closer we got to town, the more a familiar tension coiled in my gut. I knew the eyes that would be watching, the whispers that would follow in our wake. I had been their marshal for 3 years, a respected but distant figure of the law. Today I was bringing the outside world into their midst. And I was breaking my own solitude for good. As we turned onto the main street, the town seemed to hold its breath. A rancher froze with his hand on the livery door, his mouth slightly agape. 2 women, heads together over a basket of goods, fell silent, their eyes following us with open hostility. From the swinging doors of the saloon, a pair of leering faces appeared in the doorway, their expressions a mixture of crude curiosity and menace. I kept my face a mask of cold authority, my hand resting casually on the butt of my Colt, a silent warning to anyone with ideas. I dismounted in front of Croft's Mercantile and turned to help Naya down. She slid into my arms, her body trembling slightly, but when her feet touched the ground, she stood tall. She kept her head bowed, her dark hair a curtain hiding her face, but I felt her spine straighten. Pride even in the face of fear. The bell above the door announced us with a jangling shriek. Silas Croft looked up and his face froze, his thin lips tightening into a bloodless line. His gaze flickered from me to Naya, then back again, his disapproval. a palpable force in the room as cold as the air outside. "Marshall," he said, his voice dripping with a false cordiality that set my teeth on edge. "Didn't realize you'd taken on company." I ignored the jibe, placing my list of supplies on the counter. Flour, coffee, bandages, the tin of salve, and a bar of lye soap. My voice was low, but it carried the unmistakable edge of command that left no room for argument. "Just fill the order, Silas." His eyes, small and hard like pebbles, lingered on Naya with a look that made my hand itch for my gun. "You sure this is wise, Jed, bringing her here? Folks are unsettled." I met his gaze and let him see the cold fire in my own. It was a look I had perfected in the war, a look that promised consequences swift and final. "Put it on the scale, Silas." The unspoken threat hung in the air like smoke. The few other customers in the store shifted uncomfortably, suddenly finding the floorboards fascinating. Silas, ever the pragmatist, seemed to weigh the value of his prejudice against the cost of crossing a man like me. He turned and began measuring out the flour without another word. By the time we stepped back into the street, the whispers had started a low buzz of speculation and judgment that followed us like a cloud of flies. But no one approached. My presence, my badge, and the grim set of my jaw were enough to keep them at a distance. For now, back at the cabin as the evening chill began to set in, and the fire crackled to life, Naya stood by the hearth staring into the flames. She had shed the heavy coat but had pulled the quilt around her shoulders again, her shield against a world that had already judged her. "They hate me," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact delivered with a quiet, heartbreaking resignation. I hung my hat and gun belt on the peg by the door and turned to face her. The firelight played across her stoic profile. "They don't know you, Naya. They fear what they don't understand." I took a step closer, closing the distance between us. "And they'll think twice before they let that fear cross my path." Her eyes, dark and deep as a forest pool at midnight, lifted to meet mine. They held a universe of pain and a flicker of something else, something that might have been hope. "And if they come for me anyway?" I held her gaze, my own, as steady and unyielding as the mountains that framed our world. "Then they'll have to come through me first." For the first time since I had found her, a flicker of something other than fear or pain crossed her face. A long, shuddering breath escaped her lips, a sound of profound relief, as if a great weight had been lifted from her. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it was the soil in which trust might one day grow. And as I watched her in the flickering firelight, I knew that my life was no longer my own. It was inextricably bound to hers, and there was no turning back. At its heart, this story reminds us that life is often defined not by the victories we win, but by the choices we make in moments of silence when no one is watching. Jed could have turned away, could have let the snow finish what cruelty began, but he didn't. He chose compassion over convenience, duty over safety. For those of us in later years, this carries a powerful truth. Our worth isn't measured by what we avoid, but by what we are willing to carry, even when it costs us. The past may leave scars that never fully fade, but extending a hand to another, offering warmth, dignity, or simple protection, can bring a measure of healing to both giver and receiver. In a world that often feels colder and more divided, it is the small, steadfast acts of kindness that remind us of our humanity. No matter our age, we still have the ability to choose courage to protect what is right, and to bring light into another person's darkest night. Enjoying these epic Wild West stories? Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.